It is another edition of the Road to Recovery series with our friends from the Orthopedic and Spine Centers of Wisconsin. I'm Alex Strouf with you, joined again by my buddy, Dr. J.J. Prosser, a board-certified surgeon with the Orthopedic and Spine Centers of Wisconsin. And we're talking to Dr. Prosser today, an expert in sports medicine, about the wacky situation going on with Packers cornerback Jaire Alexander. Back injury earlier in the year, now listed as a shoulder injury, but not a lot of information other than a lack of mobility within the shoulder, Dr. Prosser. So when a fit young athlete comes to you and says, I'm having a lack of mobility in the shoulder, what does that tell you, and what are the steps you take to help them get back on the field?
Lack of mobility usually means that something's, wrong, as opposed to just having an injury, just having some pain. But when you start to see a functional deficit, you have to be at least suspicious that something's torn, out of place, etc. So to me, lack of mobility in the shoulder, there's something going on there.
So obviously, if you're dealing with the patient, you learn more and you figure out exactly what's going on. But shoulders are tricky, right? I mean, there are so many things that can go wrong in that area of the body. What do you do? Like how do you attack that from a non-surgical perspective?
Oh, so, I agree they're tricky. I think when you see these injuries, first of all, just seeing it, that's why we're kind of on the sidelines at these football games. A lot of times you can just tell by the mechanism of injury, most likely what's going on there. In Jaire Alexander's case, diving for a ball, the way he landed on the ground, to me, that looked very much like an AC joint, injury. Based on his interviews and a few of the little sort of hints he's given out, that's what I suspect is going on. But with regards to diagnosing these things, seeing the mechanism of injuries, number one, doing an exam is kind of number two. And if we're still stumped, the next thing we would do is to get an MRI, which usually tells the story.
Is a collarbone considered a shoulder injury? I know that might sound like a silly question, but is that considered part of the shoulder?
So it's not a silly question. So the collarbone goes from your chest to your shoulder, where the collarbone kind of connects in your chest. That's called your SC joint, sternoclavicular joint. That is not your shoulder. But where the end of the collarbone attaches toward the shoulder, that's your AC joint, and that is considered your shoulder. So it's a great question.
So it's a yes and a no, right? I mean, so maybe it wasn't that
yes
simple.
And a no, depending on which end of the collarbone you're referring to. Exactly.
Right. And I know there's been collarbone troubles for Alexander in the past. And when you bring up an AC joint, me as a fan and a viewer of football makes me go, oh, that doesn't sound super helpful when it could be a recurring injury or trauma to a past injury. That sounds a little bit more serious than maybe some expect.
I think so. Exactly. A lot of these injuries, we can say that AC joint, or we can even talk about like a shoulder dislocation. A first-time injury, the treatment is usually rest, physical therapy, sometimes an injection. If it doesn't happen again, that can be your definitive treatment. But once you start to see a recurrence of these injuries, then you kind of start to lean a little more toward surgery.
Yeah, and obviously that has not been the case with this particular instance. But walk me through maybe some of your background with shoulders. Do you see a lot of recurring injuries? Is that because we called it tricky before? I imagine, especially in a physical sport like football, that might be something that pops up time and time again.
Yeah. So, we'll just take like a shoulder dislocation, for example. So a first-time shoulder dislocation, a trainer will kind of reduce it or put it back on the field. They'll send them the physical therapy, maybe an injection, maybe a brace, but as long as it doesn't dislocate again, that's their definitive treatment. So as a surgeon, I'm not involved in that. But the people I am seeing with multiple shoulder dislocations, the studies show all the therapy and all the braces in the world can't keep it from recurring. So then it becomes more of a surgical injury. So most of the people I'm seeing are in that kind of recurrence population, and we're talking surgery. They've had a recurrence and they'll have a positive MRI showing the injury.
How about a rotator cuff? Can you explain what that is to somebody that luckily has never had one of those injuries?
Well, how young are you?
I'm 25.
So you're good probably until you're about 45.
I will say though, one of my buddies from high school just had his rotator cuff repaired. So not all of us are as lucky as me.
So the rotator cuff, there's 4 tendons. There's one in the front of the shoulder, one in the back of the shoulder, and 2 on top. And basically, these tendons sort of originate from your neck. They go out and they attach to the ball of your arm, and they're basically responsible for essentially moving your arm. And what happens is, short of a major traumatic injury, it's more of an overuse thing. For example, in a thrower, every time they throw the ball, the rotator cuff kind of rubs on the ball of your arm, on the roof of your shoulder, and it starts to kind of wear thin. And then eventually it's a setup to kind of completely tear. And sometimes you have a thrower that already has that thin rotator cuff, we'll say like a quarterback, and then maybe they have a tackle and they're much more prone to completely tear it. So
And
go ahead.
No.
So quarterbacks, pitchers, they're more prone to rotator cuff issues.
That makes sense. And I feel like that's typically where we hear of it, right? So specifically in baseball, I feel like that comes up a lot. And then also, no, go ahead.
Nope, you go.
Shoulder labrum is something else I see in what you specialize in, and you specialize in a ton. We'll get to more of that in a second. We've talked to you about ACLs and meniscuses. Menisci? What's plural meniscus?
Yeah,
meniscuses or menisci?
Menisci. Good.
But shoulder labrum, what is that, and when do you see that?
So shoulder labrum. So basically, the ball of your arm sits against the plate of your body. And the only thing that keeps the ball from rolling off the plate is the labrum. And basically, I liken the labrum to a tire on the rim of a car. It's this bumper that wraps around the plate 360 degrees. It cups the ball and it keeps it in place. So when someone has a shoulder dislocation where the ball of their arm rolls off the plate, that means they've torn the labrum. They've pulled that bumper away. So that's what a labral tear is essentially. It's a stabilizing structure. It can be torn with a traumatic injury, or it can also be torn with repetitive activity, such in a thrower. Every time you bring the arm back to throw, you stretch the labrum, and at some point it tears. And the part of the labrum you tear in a thrower is in a different location than the part of the labrum you tear in a dislocator. But those are the two kind of labral injuries you'll see. You'll see the labral tear with the instability dislocation, or you'll see the labral tear with the repetitive thrower.
Very interesting. You make it all make sense. Dr. Jaire Prosser is the best in the biz when it comes to sports-related injuries. You can find more on him and everything at the Orthopedic and Spine Centers of Wisconsin on their website, orthospinecenters.com. Dr. Prosser, thanks for not making me feel dumb and making this make sense. Appreciate you as always, my friend.
You're welcome. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome. This has been another edition of the Road to Recovery series with our friends at the Orthopedic and Spine Centers of Wisconsin.